I never told my fiancé Liam about my $5 million annual salary. He always assumed I was barely scraping by because I drive a 10-year-old Honda Civic and live in a modest apartment. When his wealthy parents invited me to a private dining room at an elite New York restaurant, I thought we were finally going to celebrate our engagement and blend our families. Instead, before I even had the chance to take off my coat, his mother slid a 40-page legal document across the heavy mahogany table, along with a $2,400 appetizer bill. She looked me dead in the eye and told me that gold diggers do not get free meals. What she did not know was that I practically owned the very people she was trying so desperately to impress. My name is Sienna. I am 33 years old, and my entire concept of love and family shattered that night. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic people who tried to put a price tag on your worth and underestimate your power. Walking into the private dining room that evening, I was nervous but hopeful. The room smelled of expensive truffles and aged wine. The chandeliers cast a warm golden light over the crisp white tablecloths. Liam was already seated next to his parents, Beatrice and Richard. I expected a warm greeting, or at least a polite smile. Instead, the atmosphere was as cold as a morgue. Before I could even pull out my own chair, Beatrice reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a thick, bound stack of papers. She slammed it down on the table with a loud thud that echoed in the quiet room. Right on top of the legal document, she placed a black leather receipt booklet. "Sign the prenup right now," Beatrice commanded, her voice dripping with absolute disdain. "And since you are joining us late, you can cover the appetizers we ordered while we waited." "We are not a charity, Sienna." I stood there, frozen, my hand still resting on the back of the chair. I looked down at the receipt. It was for $2,400. They had ordered imported caviar and rare oysters before I even arrived, and now they were demanding I pay for it. I looked at the thick legal document beneath it. The title page boldly stated it was a prenuptial agreement, but it looked more like a declaration of war. I slowly took my seat and opened the first page. The clauses were absolutely draconian. It stated that in the event of a divorce, I would walk away with absolutely zero assets. But it did not stop there. There was a specific clause demanding that I assume 50% of Liam U.S. existing credit card debt upon marriage. They were essentially trying to trap me into paying off his reckless spending while securing his entire supposed inheritance for themselves. I looked up at Liam, expecting him to intervene. I expected the man who asked me to marry him to stand up and tell his mother she had crossed a line. Instead, Liam would not even make eye contact with me. He picked up his crystal wineglass, swirling the dark red liquid, and took a slow sip. His silence was deafening. It was a massive betrayal delivered without a single word. Beatrice noticed my shock and leaned forward, resting her manicured hands on the table. "Do not look at him," she snapped. "Liam and Richard had our corporate lawyers draft this specifically to protect our family legacy. We know exactly what you are trying to do, Sienna. You think you can bat your eyes and secure a permanent ticket out of your miserable little life." I felt my heart pounding in my chest, but I forced my face to remain completely neutral. "My miserable little life," I repeated softly. Beatrice let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Please do not play dumb with us. We know you only make $45,000 a year doing some mindless data entry job. You bring absolutely nothing to this table except liability." She did not know that my mindless data entry job was actually me coding the foundational algorithms for the financial technology company I founded. A company that was currently valued in the hundreds of millions. I reinvested 90% of my income into my business and real estate portfolio, which is why I lived simply. But to Beatrice, my lack of flashy designer labels was proof of my inferiority. She took my silence as a sign of weakness and launched into a vicious, unprompted monologue designed to tear me down piece by piece. You think we do not see right through you? Beatrice continued, her voice rising in the quiet room. You live in that cramped shoebox of an apartment. You drove here tonight in that rusted 2014 Honda. I sincerely hope you parked it a few blocks away so you do not embarrass us in front of the valet. Liam needs a wife who understands high society, who understands legacy and corporate responsibility. He does not need a charity case dragging down his social standing. Richard, who had been aggressively cutting a piece of steak, finally looked up and pointed his knife at me. My wife is absolutely right, Sienna. You simply lack the pedigree required to be part of this family. Look at your shoes. They are scuffed. You wore a terrible off-the-rack dress to a five-star restaurant. You do not even know how to properly hold your water glass. I looked down at my shoes. They were comfortable loafers I wore to the office. I looked at my dress, which was clean and professional. They were not just attacking my finances, they were attacking my fundamental dignity. Beatrice was practically glowing with mean-spirited joy. She loved having a captive audience to degrade. Do you remember our trip to Aspen last winter? Beatrice asked, her eyes narrowing. Liam wanted to celebrate his promotion and ordered a $500 bottle of champagne. You practically had a panic attack when you saw the price tag. You refused to split the cost and made Liam pay for the whole thing. That is a poverty mindset, Sienna. You are terrified of money because you have never had any, and you never will. You are a parasite attaching yourself to my son Oz trust fund. The irony was physically painful. I had refused to pay for that champagne, not because I could not afford it, but because Liam had secretly begged me to cover his portion of the hotel bill the night before, since his credit cards were maxed out. I was trying to teach him financial responsibility. I looked at Liam again, giving him one last chance to tell his parents the truth. One last chance to admit that he was drowning in debt, and that I was the one who had been quietly paying for his groceries and car insurance for the past 6 months. Liam shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He looked at me with cold, hollow eyes. Just sign the papers, Sienna, he muttered. It is standard family protocol. Just be grateful my parents are even letting you sit at this table tonight. That was the exact moment the woman who loved Liam died. The heartbreak completely evaporated and was instantly replaced by a sharp, icy clarity. I was no longer a heartbroken fiancé. I was a chief executive officer evaluating a hostile takeover. I realized that arguing with them would be a waste of breath. If I defended myself, if I revealed my true wealth right then, they would simply pivot and pretend they had always respected me. They would try to sink their greedy claws into my assets instead. I needed to see exactly how far they were willing to go. I needed them to dig their own graves so deep they could never climb out. I let my shoulders slump. I forced my eyes to well up with tears, perfectly playing the role of the helpless victim they desperately wanted me to be. I looked at Beatrice with wide, fearful eyes and let my voice tremble just a little. But what if I get sick, Beatrice? I asked, my voice cracking. What if the economy crashes and I lose my data entry job? I live paycheck to paycheck. If I sign this prenup and take on Liam US debts, how will I survive if something happens to me? Richard let out a booming, cruel laugh that made the waiter standing nearby flinch. He leaned back in his chair, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. That sounds like a you problem, sweetheart, he chuckled darkly. We are not running a welfare office here. You sink or swim on your own. I looked down at the table, letting a single tear fall onto the 40-page legal document. Inside, I was not crying. I was smiling. The test was working perfectly. They had completely failed as human beings, and I was going to make sure they paid for it with everything they had. I slowly turned my head away from Richard and Beatrice and looked directly at Liam. This was the man who had proposed to me under a canopy of stars just 3 months ago. This was the man who had whispered that we were a team and that it was us against the world. I desperately wanted him to prove his parents wrong right now. I wanted him to slam his hand down on the heavy wooden table, stand up, and tell them that they were completely out of line. I waited for the righteous anger to wash over his face. I waited for him to defend the woman he supposedly loved more than anything. I stared at him, my eyes wide and pleading silently, begging him to throw me a lifeline in the middle of this suffocating room. But Liam did not move a single muscle to help me. He did not puff out his chest or raise his voice. He simply sat there looking like a cornered animal trying to blend into the expensive wallpaper. The physical distance between our chairs was only a few inches, but in that precise moment it felt like an impassable canyon. He refused to even look in my direction. His eyes were glued to the pristine white tablecloth as if he suddenly found the fabric weave absolutely fascinating. The silence in the private dining room stretched out, becoming heavy and unbearable. The only sound was the soft clinking of silverware from the main restaurant outside our closed doors. I watched as Liam nervously reached out his right hand. His fingers wrapped around the stem of his crystal wine glass. He lifted it to his lips and took a long, slow sip of the dark red Bordeaux. His hand was actually trembling slightly as he held the heavy glass. He swallowed hard, the motion visible in his tight throat. Beatrice and Richard sat perfectly still, watching him with eager, predatory smiles. They were testing him just as much as they were testing me. They wanted to see if their son was truly broken to their will, or if he would dare to defy them for a woman they deemed worthless. When Liam finally set the glass down, the soft clink echoed against the mahogany table like a judge finalizing a harsh sentence. He cleared his throat, adjusting the collar of his tailored suit jacket, a suit jacket that I had secretly paid for because his credit card had been declined at the luxury boutique register. "Look, Sienna," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. He still refused to meet my intense gaze. "You are making this a lot harder than it needs to be today. My parents are just looking out for our financial future. You have to understand the complex position I am in right now." I felt a freezing cold chill wash over my entire body. "Our future," I repeated softly, letting the words hang in the air. "You think stripping me of all my legal rights and forcing me to take on your massive debt is protecting our future, Liam?" He finally snapped his head up and looked directly at me, but there was absolutely no love left in his eyes. There was only deep annoyance and a very selfish panic. "It is not just about you," he shot back, his tone defensive and surprisingly sharp. "I have a family legacy to think about moving forward. I have my trust fund to protect from outside interference. You know how much pressure my family is under to maintain our high standing in this city. I actually sat down with the corporate lawyers last week and personally helped draft those specific clauses. I needed to make sure that my personal assets were completely insulated just in case things do not work out between us. It is just standard business practice among wealthy families. You cannot afford to take this strictly as a personal attack against your character." My brain practically short-circuited as his cold words fully processed. He had actively helped draft the most brutal clauses in the agreement. The man who kissed my forehead every single morning had secretly sat in a leather chair in some high-rise law firm, plotting how to financially ruin me if we ever got a divorce. And his core reasoning was the most pathetic lie I had ever heard in my entire life. He desperately wanted to protect his supposedly massive trust fund. The sheer audacity of that ridiculous statement almost made me burst out laughing right there at the dinner table. Liam did not have a real functioning trust fund, or at least he did not have one that actually dispensed any real usable money to him. His entire wealthy lifestyle was nothing more than an elaborate smoke and mirrors routine designed to fool outsiders. I knew exactly how much money he had in his checking account because I was the one constantly transferring hidden funds to cover his luxury apartment rent and his expensive sports car payments. His parents gave him a fancy executive title at their struggling real estate firm, but they paid him a terrible entry-level salary to keep him entirely dependent on their approval. He was a 34-year-old man playing pretend on a borrowed dime. Yet here he was proudly puffing out his chest and acting like a billionaire tycoon, protecting a massive corporate empire from a gold-digging peasant. I realized in that terrible, isolating moment that Liam was not an innocent victim of his toxic, manipulative parents. He was an active, willing participant in their grand delusion. He truly enjoyed the sick power dynamic they were creating tonight. He liked feeling socially superior to me, even if that superiority was entirely fabricated and funded by my hard work. By forcing me to sign this prenuptial agreement, he was trying to legally enforce a permanent hierarchy where I would forever remain his absolute subordinate. I sat there staring at the man I thought I was going to marry. The harsh reality of his profound betrayal settled over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. But the initial shock was already fading, replaced by a cold, analytical curiosity. I realized that arguing with them, defending my honor, or storming out of the restaurant would not give me the complete picture. If I simply walked away, they would spin the false narrative. They would tell their wealthy friends that I was an unstable, greedy gold digger who threw a massive tantrum when I realized I could not get my hands on their precious family fortune. I needed to see the absolute bottom of their dark cruelty. I needed them to put their complete lack of humanity on full display. So I decided to give them exactly what they wanted to see. I let my shoulders slump forward, making myself look as small and defeated as possible. I thought about the sheer disappointment of this evening and channeled that sadness into my eyes. I blinked rapidly, forcing hot tears to well up and spill over my cheeks. I let my breathing become shallow, perfectly mimicking the panic of a trapped woman. I looked across the table at Beatrice and Richard, letting my voice tremble. "But Richard, please," I begged, my voice cracking in a pitiful way. "What happens if I sign this strict document and something terrible goes wrong in the future? What if I get terribly sick and cannot work my daily data entry job anymore? Medical bills in this country are so expensive, and I do not have any secret savings to fall back on during emergencies. What if the fragile economy crashes and I lose my low-paying position entirely? If I agree to take on half of that massive credit card debt and forfeit any legal right to basic marital support, how am I supposed to survive? I am barely making ends meet in my small apartment right now." I looked directly at Beatrice, hoping to desperately appeal to her as a mother. "Beatrice, you raised a son. You know what it means to deeply care for someone else. If I am truly becoming part of this family, would you really just let me drown if I fell on sudden hard times? Do I not deserve some basic level of financial security if I am dedicating my entire adult life to serving your son?" I clasped my trembling hands together, resting them on the edge of the table, letting tears drop onto the polished wood. I was laying all my vulnerabilities bare, intentionally presenting myself as the weakest version of a human being. A normal person with even a shred of empathy would have softened. Instead, Richard leaned back in his plush leather chair and let out a booming, deeply cruel laugh. It was a loud, abrasive sound that made the young waiter standing near the dining room doorway physically flinch in surprise. He reached casually for his tall crystal glass of sparkling water, taking a leisurely, refreshing sip before setting it down with a heavy, dramatic thud. He slowly wiped his mouth with a crisp white linen napkin and looked at me with absolute, unfiltered disgust. "That sounds like a you problem, sweetheart." He chuckled darkly, his cold blue eyes narrowing into sharp, calculating slits. "We are definitely not running a public welfare office here. We are running a powerful family dynasty. Modern marriage is a strict corporate merger, Sienna. It is a calculated acquisition of valuable assets and powerful strategic alliances. It is absolutely not a free charity program for struggling peasants who simply cannot manage their own pathetic lives. If you get sick or somehow lose your little job, that is your own tragic personal failure. It is strictly not my successful son taking legal responsibility to carry your useless dead weight. You are a massive liability, a pure financial and social liability. Why should Liam ever risk his hard-earned inheritance to constantly subsidize your incredibly mediocre existence?" He leaned forward aggressively, pointing a thick manicured finger directly at my wet face. "You either quickly sign the legal papers and gratefully accept your lowly place, or you walk out that door empty-handed forever. There is absolutely no soft safety net for poor people like you in our elite world. You sink or swim entirely on your own." Beatrice nodded in vigorous, eager agreement, her expensive diamond earrings catching the bright chandelier light as she smiled an incredibly thin, venomous smile. "My brilliant husband is absolutely right," she immediately chimed in, her sharp tone, dripping with intense aristocratic condescension. "You are absurdly asking us to forever insure your risky life out of our own deep pockets. That is incredibly selfish and greedy, Sienna. If you truly loved Liam unconditionally, you would not be sitting here pathetically begging for unearned handouts. You would happily and silently sign the binding agreement to completely prove that your romantic intentions are pure. The obvious fact that you are actively crying over future financial security just proves that we were entirely right about you all along. You only wanted the luxurious lifestyle. You only ever wanted the family money." I looked quietly down at the table, letting another perfect fake tear fall onto the thick, heavy pages of the brutal prenuptial agreement. Inside, I was not crying at all. Inside, I was smiling a remarkably cold and triumphant smile. The ultimate character test was working perfectly. I had generously handed them a shovel, and they had eagerly dug their own deep graves. They had completely failed as decent human beings. I finally looked at Liam, seeing him blankly staring at his phone detached from this emotional slaughter. I had my definitive answer. I knew exactly who these awful people really were. The beautiful illusion of family was entirely shattered, leaving only the raw, ugly truth behind. The sad time for crying was officially truly over. Just as the crushing silence settled over the table, the heavy double doors of the private dining room swung open with an aggressive thud. I turned my head expecting to see the waiter returning to clear the awful tension, but instead my future sister-in-law Claire marched into the room. She was wearing a brightly colored designer trench coat that cost more than my first car. Her heels clicked sharply against the polished hardwood floor, demanding absolute attention from everyone in the room. Right behind her walked her husband Jamal. Jamal was a tall, handsome black man who always looked incredibly exhausted whenever he was forced to attend these highly toxic family gatherings. He gave me a brief, sympathetic nod as he walked in, but his eyes quickly darted to the floor. He knew the brutal dynamics of this family just as well as I did. He was a successful self-made logistics manager, but to Beatrice and Richard he was just another outsider who had somehow infiltrated their precious bloodline. Claire did not even bother to greet her parents or apologize for being nearly 45 minutes late to our supposed engagement dinner. Instead, she made a direct beeline straight for my chair. I noticed she was lugging a massive black plastic trash bag in her left hand. It was the kind of heavy-duty bag you use for yard waste, and it looked completely absurd contrasting with her expensive leather handbag. Before I could even ask her how her evening was going, she stopped right next to my seat, lifted the heavy plastic bag, and dropped it squarely onto my lap. The sheer weight of it knocked the breath out of my lungs for a second. The smell of cheap mothballs and stale perfume instantly assaulted my nose. I pushed the bulky bag back slightly so it would not crush my legs, looking up at her in total confusion. I thought perhaps she had brought some sort of strange, oversized family heirloom, or maybe a bizarre practical joke to lighten the heavy mood. But Claire just stood there looking down at me with an expression of profound pity mixed with intense arrogance. She crossed her arms over her chest and let out a dramatic, heavy sigh, as if doing this incredible favor for me was physically draining her energy. She rolled her eyes theatrically before speaking to the entire table. "I simply had to do something about this tragic situation today because I could not stand it anymore. I spent my entire afternoon cleaning out my huge walk-in closet," Claire announced, her shrill voice echoing off the expensive wood-paneled walls of the restaurant. Jamal tried to tell me to just drop it off at the local charity bin downtown, but I told him no. I told him we have our very own charity case sitting right here in the family now. She reached down and violently ripped a hole in the top of the black plastic bag, pulling out a bright pink ruffled blouse that looked like it belonged in a terrible 80s music video. It had a massive permanent coffee stain right down the front collar. "These are all my old out-of-season designer pieces," she continued, tossing the stained blouse directly onto my dinner plate. "Most of them only have a few minor tears or missing buttons, so they are perfectly fine for someone of your social standing." I figured since you are always wearing those tragic little off-the-rack outfits, you could really use a serious wardrobe upgrade. I know you have those cute little freelance data entry interviews you go to sometimes when you are trying to make a few extra dollars. If you wear these, maybe people will actually take you somewhat seriously in the professional world. And more importantly, it will finally stop you from completely embarrassing my brother when he takes you out in public places. It is honestly humiliating for him to be seen with someone who dresses like they just rolled out of a discount clothing bin. You should honestly be thanking me on your knees for this massive favor. I am giving you a brand new life right now. Beatrice let out a delighted little gasp and clapped her hands together softly, as if Claire had just cured a major global disease. "Oh, Claire, that is incredibly generous of you," Beatrice cooed, smiling warmly at her daughter. "You have always had such a beautiful giving heart, and we are all so proud of your charitable nature. See, Sienna, we are taking care of you already. You just need to sign that legal paperwork, and you get to enjoy all these wonderful family perks." I slowly turned my head to look at Jamal. He had retreated to the far corner of the room, looking like he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. He quietly muttered under his breath, telling Claire that this was entirely unnecessary and incredibly rude, but Richard immediately shot him a terrifying glare, silencing him instantly. Once again, Liam said absolutely nothing to defend me. He just picked at his white cloth napkin, avoiding the massive trash bag sitting on my lap like it was completely invisible. He was a complete coward hiding behind his wealthy mother and his arrogant sister. He would rather watch me be treated like human garbage than stand up for what was actually right. This family was a complete nightmare wrapped in expensive clothing. I looked down at the overflowing bag of discarded trash. Under normal circumstances, a woman might burst into tears or scream at the sheer indignity of being handed actual garbage at a high-end restaurant. But I just sat there, gently tracing the edge of the plastic bag with my thumb. The absolute irony of the situation was almost intoxicating. Claire was standing there, acting like a benevolent billionaire queen, bestowing gifts upon a lowly peasant. But I knew the absolute truth about Claire and her ridiculous financial reality. I knew because my financial technology company had recently run a comprehensive background algorithm on Liam and his entire immediate family when I was considering buying out Richard and his failing real estate firm. I knew for a definitive fact that Claire was currently drowning in over $80,000 of high-interest credit card debt just to maintain the shallow illusion of her wealthy lifestyle. She bought all of her so-called designer clothes from shady overseas resale websites and financed her luxury car at a staggering 20% interest rate. She was completely broke. They all were. They were an entire family of fragile paper tigers desperately trying to maintain their fake dominance by tearing me down. I calmly folded my hands over the trash bag, looking right into Claire and her cold, unfeeling eyes. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of anger. I offered her a slow, chilling smile that made her arrogant expression falter for just a fraction of a second. The game was finally reaching its climax, and I held every single winning card in my hand. I would ruin them all. Jamal watched the heavy black plastic trash bag settle onto my lap, and I could see a sudden physical shift in his entire posture. Up until this exact moment, he had been doing what he always did at these suffocating family gatherings. He had been blending quietly into the background, keeping his head down and trying to survive the evening without causing a major scene. But watching his entitled wife dump a bag of stained, discarded clothing onto my lap under the disgusting guise of high society charity was the final straw. He took a heavy step forward, his expensive leather shoes making a sharp, echoing sound against the polished hardwood floor. His broad shoulders tensed under his tailored shirt, and the muscles in his jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth might actually shatter. "Claire, that is quite enough," Jamal said, his deep baritone voice cutting sharply through the sickeningly sweet atmosphere Beatrice and Claire had just created. His tone was not incredibly loud, but it possessed a heavy, commanding authority that instantly sucked the remaining air out of the room. He reached out and firmly grasped Claire by her elbow, trying to gently but forcefully pull her away from my chair. You are crossing a massive line right now. Pick up that bag of garbage and apologize to Sienna immediately. This is not charity, Claire. This is just plain cruelty, and I will not stand here and let you humiliate this woman in public. Claire yanked her arm out of his firm grasp, as if his touch had physically burned her skin. She turned to face her husband, her perfectly manicured eyebrows pulling together in a dramatic expression of highly offended innocence. She looked at him, not like a loving equal partner, but like a misbehaving servant who had just spoken, completely out of turn, in front of important wealthy guests. "Excuse me, Jamal," she snapped, her shrill voice echoing sharply off the elegant wood-paneled dining room walls. "Do not ever speak to me that way in front of my own family. You clearly do not understand what is happening here because you simply do not understand the complex nuances of our elite social circle. I am actually trying to help her. I am trying to elevate her personal presentation so she does not drag my brother down into the mud. You should honestly be thanking me for actively protecting the precious family image instead of taking her pathetic side." Jamal slowly shook his head, a profound look of absolute exhaustion and deep disgust washing over his handsome face. "There is absolutely no nuance here, Claire," he replied, his voice dropping another incredibly serious octave. "You are maliciously bullying her. You are parading your supposed wealth around to make her feel incredibly small because it makes you feel temporarily powerful. It is embarrassing to witness, and it makes you look incredibly insecure. I am telling you right now to take this bag of trash off her lap and sincerely apologize." Before Claire could even open her mouth to unleash another highly toxic response, Richard violently slammed his heavy crystal water glass down onto the mahogany table. The loud, aggressive thud made everyone in the room physically jump, except for me. Richard slowly stood up from his dominant chair, smoothing the front of his expensive gray tailored suit jacket. He locked his cold, pale eyes directly onto Jamal, and the sheer level of aristocratic entitlement radiating from him was absolutely suffocating. "You need to watch your disrespectful tone very carefully, young man," Richard warned, his voice dripping with a poisonous mix of intense condescension and severe microaggression. "You seem to have completely forgotten exactly who you are speaking to, and more importantly, exactly where you came from. You are addressing my daughter, a woman of pure pedigree and high standing. A woman who generously gave you a designated seat at our exclusive table when you were nothing but a struggling nobody trying desperately to climb the corporate ladder." Jamal instantly stiffened, his large hands balling into incredibly tight fists at his sides. I watched the horrible scene unfold, feeling a deep wave of sickening familiarity. Jamal was a highly successful, self-made logistics manager. He had built his entire impressive career from the ground up through sheer fierce determination and brilliant strategic planning. He worked 50-hour weeks managing highly complex supply chains, and he made an incredibly honest, lucrative living. But to Richard and Beatrice, none of that actual hard work mattered at all. Because Jamal was a black man who did not come from established old money, they viewed his entire existence as a charitable diversity project they had personally funded. They constantly dismissed his genuine intellectual achievements and attributed his entire professional success to the mere fact that he had somehow convinced their beautiful daughter to marry him. "You need to learn to know your proper place in this family, Jamal." Richard continued, stepping closer and pointing a thick, threatening finger directly at his son-in-law. "You are only here tonight as a lucky guest of our grand family legacy. We graciously elevated you out of your ordinary background. We introduced you to the absolute right people at the private country club. We gave you the sophisticated cultural polish you desperately lacked. And yet you stand here in a five-star restaurant publicly disrespecting my daughter because you want to defend a penniless gold digger who stubbornly refuses to sign a standard legal document." Richard leaned in, slightly lowering his menacing voice to deliver the final, deeply degrading blow. "People from your particular background often struggle to fully understand the difficult, strict measures required to properly protect generational wealth. I strongly suggest you take a huge step back. Keep your mouth firmly shut and take detailed notes on how real families intelligently handle their vital business affairs. Do not ever bite the hand that feeds you, Jamal, or you might just find yourself right back where you started with absolutely nothing. The blatant racism and brutal classist venom laced into every single carefully chosen word Richard spoke made my blood run absolutely cold. It was not just a casual microaggression, it was a blatant, terrifying assertion of toxic supremacy disguised as fatherly corporate advice. He was explicitly telling Jamal that his worth was entirely conditional and strictly tied to his quiet, absolute obedience. I quickly looked over at Liam, expecting surely this would be the defining moment he finally spoke up. Surely Liam would fiercely defend his brother-in-law from such a horrific, unprovoked attack. But Liam just sat there, taking a slow, cowardly sip of his expensive red wine, nodding his head in silent, pathetic agreement with his vile father. Liam was an absolute coward, perfectly content to watch another innocent person be violently torn to shreds as long as it kept the negative critical attention away from himself. I shifted my intense gaze back to Jamal. I could clearly see the massive internal psychological battle raging violently behind his dark brown eyes. I knew exactly how badly he desperately wanted to scream at them. I knew he wanted to physically tear Richard apart and expose the massive, disgusting hypocrisy of this entire wealthy charade. But I also saw the heavy, suffocating chains of long-term emotional manipulation dragging him completely down. He somehow truly loved Claire, despite her awful, glaring flaws, and he had spent so many exhausting years trying to prove his genuine worth to these terrible, unforgiving people. He took a deep, shaky, agonizing breath, slowly unclenching his tight fists and taking a physical, defeated step back into the dark shadows of the room. He swallowed his immense pride, retreating into agonizing silence, because he falsely believed he had no other viable choice. In that exact, agonizing moment, our eyes met across the brightly lit, tense dining room. It was only for a tiny fraction of a second, but a profound, silent understanding passed permanently between us. I did not see Jamal as a weak, defeated man giving up. I saw a brilliant, exhausted survivor who was simply temporarily trapped in the exact same toxic psychological web that they were currently trying to wrap tightly around me. We were both ultimate outsiders. We were both the designated helpless scapegoats brought into this terrible family solely to be harshly judged, heavily criticized, and ultimately used to prop up their incredibly fragile, broken egos. They viciously hated Jamal for the exact same underlying reason they fiercely hated me. We confidently represented the genuine, honest hard work and authentic reality that they completely lacked in their own miserable lives. But there was one massive, incredible difference between Jamal and me tonight. Jamal actually fully believed their grand theatrical illusion. He actually truly believed that Richard and Beatrice held all the supreme financial and social power in this private room. He did not know that Richard was currently drowning in millions of dollars of toxic corporate debt, and that Claire was secretly maxing out high-interest credit cards just to buy her weekly fancy groceries. He did not know that the powerful generational wealth Richard was so proudly and aggressively bragging about was currently resting dangerously on the absolute terrifying edge of total catastrophic collapse. I sat very quietly under the heavy, disgusting weight of the black plastic trash bag resting on my lap. I did not break eye contact with Jamal. I offered him a very slow, almost imperceptible, confident nod. A silent, unbreakable promise that this living nightmare was not going to last much longer. Richard foolishly thought he had just successfully silenced the only dissenting voice in the room. He arrogantly thought he had completely won the psychological battle by putting Jamal in his place and forcing me into a helpless corner. But he was completely and utterly wrong. By brutally attacking Jamal, Richard had just made this incredibly personal. I was no longer just going to quietly walk away and peacefully save myself. I was going to systematically, violently dismantle their entire fake empire right in front of their horrified eyes. I was going to publicly expose their massive hidden debts, their completely fraudulent lives, and their pathetic deep insecurities. I was going to burn their fake legacy to the absolute ground, and I was going to happily make sure that Jamal was standing right next to me when the glorious smoke finally cleared. Richard turned his attention back to me, his chest puffed out with a sickening sense of complete victory. He had successfully bullied his son-in-law into total silence, and now he was ready to deliver his final crushing blow to me. He reached for his expensive suit jacket, adjusting the lapels with a smug, self-satisfied smile. He leaned across the heavy mahogany table, looking at me not as a future family member, but as a minor annoying obstacle he was about to permanently eliminate. He let out a soft, chilling chuckle that made my stomach turn completely over. You see, Sienna Richard began, his voice low and dripping with intense arrogance. I think you are finally starting to understand exactly how this elite world actually works. We are not just a family, we are a massive corporate institution. And just like any successful high-level institution, we are required to make highly strategic decisions regarding our future leadership and our valuable assets. Liam is the sole heir to my massive real estate empire, and his eventual marriage is the most critical business merger our family will ever negotiate in this competitive, ruthless modern corporate real estate market today. We simply cannot afford to throw that incredible opportunity away on a completely worthless emotional attachment to a woman who brings absolutely no capital to the negotiating table. He picked up his crystal wine glass, swirling the expensive red liquid around and around, taking a slow, deliberate sip before continuing his vicious monologue. We tried to give you a small chance to gracefully accept your lowly position by signing the legal paperwork tonight. But your pathetic emotional outburst has only completely confirmed what Beatrice and I have known from the very beginning of this terribly inconvenient, ridiculous, tragic romantic affair. You are entirely unfit to stand beside my son in high society. I sat there listening to his cruel words, my face completely devoid of any outward emotion. I wanted him to keep talking. I wanted him to expose every single dark corner of his greedy, manipulative mind. And Richard was more than happy to oblige. He set his glass down with a heavy thud and folded his manicured hands together, resting them on the table. In fact, he continued, a wicked gleam shining brightly in his cold blue eyes. We have already made other highly beneficial arrangements for Liam. Arrangements that completely align with our prestigious family legacy and our aggressive corporate expansion goals. I felt a sudden sharp twist in my chest, not from heartbreak, but from sheer profound disbelief. I looked over at Liam, who was suddenly looking down at his lap, refusing to make any eye contact with me. Richard smiled broadly, thoroughly enjoying my silent reaction. That is right, Sienna, Richard boasted loudly, his voice echoing in the private dining room. Liam is going to be dating a woman who actually belongs in our exclusive tax bracket. She is a truly remarkable, beautiful, brilliant daughter. She is the child of a major Silicon Valley venture capitalist. Her father is the chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings, one of the most powerful and aggressive financial firms on the entire West Coast. She went to elite private boarding schools, she understands corporate strategy, and most importantly, she brings massive generational wealth and high-level industry connections to our family. She is a true equal partner for my son, not a desperate financial burden, looking for a free, easy ride into absolute luxury. Beatrice nodded eagerly, her diamond necklace sparkling brightly under the warm, bright luxury chandelier light. Oh, she is absolutely wonderful, Beatrice chimed in, her voice overly sweet and entirely fake. We had lunch with her family at the country club just last week, and the chemistry between her and Liam was simply undeniable. She already understands the immense pressure of maintaining a wealthy public image. She knows exactly how to host important charity galas, and she actually knows how to dress appropriately for a five-star restaurant. Beatrice shot a nasty, pointed look at my sensible work clothes before turning her extremely proud, joyful gaze back over to my incredibly silent, pathetic, cowardly fiancé, Liam. Richard cut in, completely ignoring his wife to get back to his main arrogant point. This is not just about finding a socially acceptable wife for Liam. Richard explained, his tone shifting to sound like a professor giving a lecture to a slow student. This new relationship is a highly calculated financial maneuver. You see, my real estate firm is currently planning a massive aggressive expansion into the commercial tech sector. Vanguard Holdings has generously agreed to provide a massive influx of venture capital to fund our new upcoming projects across the entire booming northern state commercial business district rapidly. It is a brilliant synergy of two powerful old money families coming together to completely dominate the modern market. By Liam marrying this venture capitalist daughter, we are solidly cementing a billion-dollar alliance. We are ensuring that our family legacy will continue to grow and absolutely dominate the city for the next 100 years. He said the words Vanguard Holdings with such intense reverence and profound pride. He spoke about this supposed billion-dollar alliance like he was a brilliant mastermind, orchestrating the greatest business deal of the modern century. But as I sat there listening to him brag about his incredible strategic genius, it took every single ounce of my willpower not to burst into hysterical laughter right there at the dinner table. Richard was standing there proudly boasting about his massive upcoming bailout from Vanguard Holdings, completely unaware of the absolute catastrophic reality of his situation. He thought he was cleverly manipulating a powerful Silicon Valley titan to save his deeply failing bankrupt real estate company. He thought he was trading his son, like a shiny corporate asset, to secure a massive influx of cash to easily pay off his huge, hidden, mounting, terrible bad business debts. But I knew the absolute truth about Vanguard Holdings. I knew the exact intricate details of their entire venture capital portfolio. I knew precisely how much money they controlled and exactly who pulled their powerful financial strings. I knew all of this because my own highly successful financial technology company had just quietly completely acquired Vanguard Holdings less than 3 weeks ago in a massive, aggressive corporate takeover. I was the ultimate parent company. I was the absolute top of the financial food chain that Richard was so desperately trying to climb, using his son as total pathetic romantic bait. He was literally sitting right across the table from the exact person who owned his supposed billionaire savior. The sheer mind-boggling irony of him using my own recently acquired subsidiary to try and intimidate me was almost too delicious to fully process. I slowly looked at Liam again, observing his weak, cowardly posture. He was totally willing to abandon our entire relationship to date this other woman simply because his father told him she had access to a massive corporate checkbook and endless, extremely powerful, wealthy, elite social business connections that would endlessly fund his utterly shallow, lazy life. I slowly turned my head away from Richard and his arrogant boasting. I focused all of my attention entirely on the man sitting directly next to me. The man who had placed a ring on my finger and promised to love me forever just a few short months ago. Liam was staring intensely at his expensive polished leather shoes, acting as if he had suddenly gone completely deaf. The heavy, suffocating silence in the room seemed to press down on my shoulders, but I refused to break my gaze. I needed to hear the absolute truth directly from his own mouth. I needed to look into his eyes and see exactly who I had been sleeping next to all this time. Liam, I said quietly, my voice perfectly steady and devoid of any tears. Look at me right now. Is what your father just said actually true? Are you really planning to date another woman just to secure a corporate bailout for this family? He flinched slightly at the sound of my calm voice, but he did not look up immediately. He took a long, slow breath, his chest rising and falling beneath his perfectly tailored suit jacket. Finally, he lifted his head. His eyes were completely void of any guilt or remorse. There was only a cold, calculating emptiness that chilled me to the absolute bone. He shifted his weight in the heavy mahogany chair, suddenly looking incredibly defensive. You have to understand how complicated my position is, Sienna, he began, his voice carrying a pathetic, whining tone. My father is under a massive amount of corporate pressure right now to secure this new venture capital funding. This is not just about simple romance or petty feelings. This is about preserving our powerful generational wealth and securing the future of our entire real estate empire. I stared at him, refusing to let him hide behind his father's empty corporate jargon. "Stop repeating Richard's lines," I demanded softly. "I am asking you a direct personal question, Liam. Have you already been talking to this woman behind my back while we are actively engaged?" Liam clenched his jaw, looking quickly over at his mother Beatrice for some sort of silent emotional support. She offered him an encouraging nod, her diamond earrings catching the bright light of the luxury chandelier. "Yes," Liam finally admitted, his voice dropping slightly. "We have been texting each other for the past 2 weeks. My parents properly introduced us at a private country club charity event, and we simply hit it off. She completely understands the intense daily pressure of coming from a highly successful, wealthy family. She understands the strict social obligations and the heavy public expectations that you simply cannot seem to grasp." I felt a bizarre wave of absolute clarity wash over my entire mind. He was not being forced into this arrangement against his own will. He was a fully willing and eager participant. He had been smiling in my face, kissing me good morning, and then secretly texting a billionaire's daughter all afternoon to secure his own lazy financial future. "I love you, Sienna. I really truly do." Liam continued, trying desperately to sound like a tragic romantic hero making a terrible sacrifice. "But you have to be totally realistic about our situation. I have a very specific high-class lifestyle to naturally maintain. I grew up with expensive vacations, luxury cars, and elite social access. That is simply who I fundamentally am as a person. I cannot just give all of that up to live in a cramped, tiny apartment and clip grocery coupons for the rest of my adult life. You are a wonderful, sweet girl, but you will never be able to afford the kind of life that I actually require to be truly happy. You lack the necessary financial pedigree and the vital social connections. Marrying you would be financial suicide for me. It would completely ruin my public reputation and absolutely destroy my future earning potential in the corporate real estate market." The sheer audacity of his incredibly arrogant statement was almost physically blinding. He was sitting there wearing a designer suit that I had secretly paid for using a credit card that I was quietly paying off every single month. He drove an expensive sports car that I was secretly subsidizing because his parents paid him an absolute garbage salary. His entire luxurious high-class lifestyle was completely fabricated and heavily funded by my own relentless hard work. Yet he was looking down his nose at me, telling me that I was far too poor to properly maintain his elite standard of living. It was the absolute peak of disgusting, spoiled delusion. He honestly believed he was a wealthy, powerful king, tragically breaking the heart of a lowly peasant girl. He had no idea he was actually a broke, pathetic parasite, lecturing the very host that was desperately keeping him alive. I did not scream at him. I did not throw my water glass in his face or flip the heavy dining table. I simply sat there, letting his brutal, shallow words hang heavily in the tense air between us. I carefully studied his weak chin and his cowardly shifting eyes. Every single shred of affection I ever held for this man instantly evaporated into total nothingness. He was completely worthless. The pathetic excuse he just gave me was the final absolute confirmation I needed. Liam was entirely driven by pure, unadulterated greed and a desperate, sad need for unearned social status. He would gladly sell his own soul and betray the woman he supposedly loved just to keep playing pretend in a fake rich world. The absolute worst part was that he wanted me to quietly accept this devastating humiliation as if it was a completely logical business transaction. I took a slow, deep breath, locking my steady gaze with his nervous, flickering eyes. The emotional test was now officially entirely complete. The devastating reality of what Liam had just admitted hung heavily in the air between us. He was actually sitting there and proudly justifying his profound betrayal as a simple matter of maintaining his luxurious lifestyle. I watched his face, searching for even a tiny flicker of regret, but there was absolutely nothing there. He had completely detached himself from my feelings. He had already mentally moved on to his billionaire venture capitalist heiress, and I was just the final annoying piece of paperwork he needed to file away before he could secure his massive corporate bailout. I took a deep, steady breath, feeling a strange sense of absolute calm wash over my entire body. The intense heartbreak was completely gone, replaced by a razor-sharp focus. Beatrice sensed the shift in my demeanor, but she completely misinterpreted my calm silence as total defeat. She thought I was finally broken. She thought I had finally realized that I was completely outmatched by their supreme wealth and powerful social standing. A wide, triumphant smile spread across her heavily powdered face. She leaned back in her plush dining chair and gracefully reached for her expensive designer leather handbag resting on the floor beside her. She unzipped it with a loud, deliberate motion that drew the attention of everyone at the table. "We are all reasonable adults here, Sienna." Beatrice began, her voice taking on a sickeningly sweet and deeply patronizing tone. She sounded like a wealthy philanthropist speaking to a very slow and uneducated charity case. "We understand that this transition might be a little difficult for you to process emotionally right now, but we also know that people from your specific background are usually very practical when it comes to basic survival." She pulled a long, slender custom leather checkbook out of her bag and placed it gently on the polished mahogany table. She reached into her bag again and retrieved an incredibly thick, gold-plated fountain pen. The sharp, metallic click of the pen echoing in the quiet private room sounded like a final heavy lock sliding into place. She opened the checkbook, smoothing down the crisp paper with her perfectly manicured fingernails. "We genuinely do not want you to leave here tonight feeling completely empty-handed," Beatrice continued, keeping her eyes focused entirely on the paper as she began to write. "We recognize that you did invest some of your personal time into this entirely misguided relationship with our son. We consider ourselves to be incredibly generous people, and we always believe in offering a fair severance package when we terminate a bad contract." I watched in total absolute fascination as her gold pen aggressively scratched across the surface of the check. She was writing out numbers with such intense theatrical flair. She blew softly on the wet ink to dry it, before carefully tearing the check from the binding. The ripping sound of the thick, expensive paper was loud and abrasive. She picked up the small piece of paper between her index finger and thumb, holding it up slightly, so the warm chandelier light caught the bold black ink. She looked directly into my eyes, her expression hardening into a cold, ruthless glare. Then she slowly slid the check across the smooth wooden table, right over the terrible prenuptial agreement, and stopped it exactly 1 inch from my resting hands. I looked down at the paper. It was a check made out to my name for exactly $50,000. "Look at that number very carefully," Sienna Beatrice instructed, her voice dropping into a harsh, commanding whisper. "That is $50,000. That is probably more actual cash than you have ever seen in your entire miserable life. That is more than you make in an entire year of doing your pathetic little data entry job. It is a massive fortune for a girl like you. I want you to pick up that check and put it securely in your cheap little purse. Then I want you to stand up, walk out of this fancy restaurant, and never look back. You are going to go back to your tiny, cramped apartment tonight, and you are going to pack up all of your cheap belongings. By tomorrow morning, I expect you to be completely gone. I want you to vanish from the life of my son entirely. You will delete his phone number, you will block him on all social media, and you will never attempt to contact any member of this family ever again. If you try to reach out to him, or if you try to cause any sort of public scene to ruin his new relationship, I will personally hire the best corporate lawyers in this city to sue you for harassment and destroy your pathetic little life. But if you quietly take this generous money and disappear right now, you can use it to pay off your sad little debts and maybe buy yourself a slightly better used car." I sat perfectly still, staring down at the $50,000 check resting on the table. The sheer staggering audacity of her ridiculous bribe was almost intoxicating. She genuinely believed she was offering me a life-changing fortune. She honestly thought she was buying my total submission and my permanent silence with a sum of money that I literally made in just 3 days of passive income from my real estate portfolio alone. It was the absolute ultimate insult wrapped up in a pretty corporate bow. I looked at Liam, expecting him to at least look slightly embarrassed by his mother basically buying his freedom, but he just sat there looking immensely relieved. He thought the messy problem was finally solved. They foolishly thought I was completely defeated and totally broken. I slowly reached out my hand and placed my fingertips gently on the edge of the crisp paper. The entire room held its collective breath, eagerly waiting for me to surrender and finally walk away. The heavy, suffocating silence in the private dining room stretched out for what felt like an absolute eternity. I sat perfectly still, staring down at the crisp $50,000 check resting on the polished mahogany table just inches from my fingertips. The entire family was watching me with bated breath, eagerly waiting for me to snatch up the money and run away like a frightened little mouse. But before I could even make a single movement, the heavy double doors of the private room swung open. Our designated waiter, a polite young man in a crisp white uniform, stepped into the thick tension, carrying a silver tray and a leather-bound menu pad. He possessed an eager professional smile, entirely unaware of the absolute psychological warfare currently happening at our table. He approached the head of the table and cleared his throat softly, trying to politely interrupt the intense staring contest between Beatrice and me. "Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen," the waiter said, his cheerful voice completely shattering the heavy quiet of the room. "I hope you thoroughly enjoyed your imported caviar and fresh oyster appetizers this evening. If everyone is ready, I would love to take your orders for the main course right now. Our head chef has prepared a spectacular roasted duck special tonight that I highly recommend." Beatrice did not even bother to look up at the polite young waiter. She kept her cold, piercing eyes locked firmly on my face, her lips curled into a vicious, triumphant sneer. She raised her perfectly manicured right hand, flicking her wrist in a highly dismissive gesture, as if she were swatting away an annoying insect. "Oh, we will certainly be ordering the expensive roasted duck specials for the family," Beatrice announced, her voice projecting loudly so that every single person in the room could hear her crystal clear. "But you do not need to take a main course order for our temporary guest sitting at the end of the table. She is actually leaving us right this very second." Beatrice let out a short, mocking laugh that sounded like shattered glass. In fact, she continued, pointing a sharp finger directly at my half-empty crystal water glass. "Why do you not be a dear and bring a cheap plastic to-go box for her tap water? She has a very long, sad drive back to her tiny little apartment tonight, and we certainly would not want her to get dehydrated on the way home. Would we, Sienna?" The young waiter froze, completely, entirely unsure of how to properly handle this level of blatant upper-class cruelty. His professional smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer panicked discomfort. He nervously shifted his weight from foot to foot, looking back and forth between Beatrice and me. He clearly wanted to magically disappear into the expensive wallpaper. Beatrice absolutely reveled in his visible awkwardness. She loved making working-class people feel incredibly uncomfortable because it only further cemented her sick feeling of absolute supreme power. I slowly lowered my head, letting my hair fall forward to completely obscure my face from their greedy, prying eyes. The rest of the toxic family immediately took my downward gaze as the ultimate sign of total emotional defeat. Claire let out a loud, obnoxious snort of laughter, picking up her crystal wine glass and taking a celebratory sip. She leaned over and whispered something incredibly nasty to Richard, who responded with a smug, self-satisfied grin. Even Liam, the man who had supposedly loved me more than anything else in the entire world, let out a long, heavy sigh of profound relief. He genuinely thought the messy, dramatic part of his evening was finally over, and he could peacefully go back to drinking expensive wine and texting his billionaire venture capitalist heiress. I sat there with my head bowed, and my shoulders suddenly began to tremble. They started shaking with small, rhythmic movements that quickly escalated into deep, heavy tremors. I raised my hands and covered my face, burying my eyes in my palms. To the terrible people sitting around the mahogany table, the visual narrative was absolutely perfectly clear. They thought I was completely broken. They thought the massive public humiliation delivered by the waiter, combined with the crushing reality of the $50,000 bribe, had finally shattered my fragile spirit. They honestly believed I was sitting there sobbing uncontrollably, overwhelmed by the sheer unstoppable power of their generational wealth and their elite social standing. Beatrice actually let out a soft, contented sigh, loudly whispering to Claire that it was always so pathetic watching poor people realize they had finally lost the big game. But they were completely and utterly wrong about me. I was not crying sad tears at all. I was actually biting down hard on the inside of my cheek to violently suppress a massive fit of genuine hysterical laughter. Behind my covered hands, my entire demeanor had transformed into pure calculating ice. The shaking of my shoulders was the physical manifestation of sheer absolute adrenaline flooding my entire nervous system. I had given them every single possible opportunity to show just one tiny ounce of human decency, and they had spectacularly failed every single test. They had shown me their absolute worst, most disgusting colors, and now I owed them absolutely nothing. The quiet, sad little data entry girl they thought they were bullying no longer existed. In her place sat the ruthless chief executive officer who regularly destroyed massive fraudulent corporations before breakfast. The long, emotional charade was officially over. I took one final deep breath, letting the cold, icy reality of what I was about to do settle deeply into my bones. I lowered my two hands from my face and sat up perfectly straight in my heavy wooden chair. I looked directly across the long, expensive table at Beatrice, quickly wiping away a single imaginary tear from my completely dry left eye now. I slowly lowered my hands from my face and sat up completely straight in my heavy wooden dining chair. The entire family was waiting for me to reach out with trembling fingers and eagerly snatch the $50,000 check that Beatrice had so generously slid across the polished mahogany table. They were fully expecting to see my eyes red and puffy, violently overflowing with tragic tears of ultimate defeat. Instead, they were met with a perfectly calm, entirely dry face and a gaze so intensely cold it could have instantly frozen the imported champagne sitting in their crystal glasses. The sudden drastic shift in my physical demeanor completely threw off the toxic rhythm of the room. Beatrice immediately stopped her smug, victorious smiling. Richard slowly lowered his expensive water glass, narrowing his pale blue eyes in deep, arrogant confusion. They simply could not comprehend why the pathetic poor girl was not following their meticulously crafted script of total humiliation. Liam actually shifted uncomfortably in his seat, nervously adjusting the collar of his tailored suit jacket as he finally looked directly at my face. He expected to see a broken, heartbroken woman, but he only saw a highly calculated, absolute emptiness. I did not reach for the crisp check. I did not make a single move to stand up or grab my small purse. I just sat there staring at them with an eerie, unnerving stillness that made the heavy silence in the private dining room feel incredibly dangerous. Claire was the very first person to completely lose her limited patience. She had been sitting there practically vibrating with mean-spirited excitement, eagerly waiting for the exact moment I would finally run out of the restaurant in absolute shame. When I did not immediately flee, she let out a loud, dramatic sigh of profound, extreme annoyance. She aggressively tossed her white linen napkin onto her half-eaten plate of expensive appetizers and leaned aggressively forward. "Are you completely deaf? Or are you just incredibly stupid, Sienna?" She snapped, her shrill voice echoing sharply against the wood-paneled walls. "My mother just gave you a massive fortune. She just offered you a miraculous golden ticket to pay off your pathetic little debts and fix your sad, miserable life. Take the damn money and leave before we change our generous minds and have the restaurant security guards physically drag you out to the street." I kept my eyes completely fixed on Beatrice, ignoring Claire entirely. That blatant dismissal absolutely infuriated my entitled sister-in-law. She hated being ignored more than anything else in the world. She suddenly pushed her heavy chair back, the wooden legs scraping loudly, violently against the hardwood floor. "If you are going to be stubborn and refuse to pack up your cheap little things properly, then I am going to reclaim what rightfully belongs to our family right now." Claire announced, her tone turning highly venomous. She stomped her expensive designer heels around the edge of the large table, marching directly toward my side of the room. Before I could even fully process what her ridiculous statement actually meant, Claire aggressively lunged right across the corner of the heavy wooden table. She did not politely ask for the ring or demand that Liam take it back. She physically attacked me. Her perfectly manicured fingers reached out with startling vicious speed, tightly grabbing my left wrist with a shockingly painful grip. Her long, sharp nails dug painfully into my skin as she aggressively yanked my arm forward, trying to completely forcefully rip the 2-carat diamond engagement ring right off my ring finger. I gasped in genuine physical shock, trying to pull my arm back, but she was pulling with the frantic, desperate strength of a completely unhinged woman. "This diamond ring is a precious, sacred family heirloom," Claire hissed through clenched teeth, her face flushed red with absolute intense greedy rage. She twisted my wrist violently, trying to slide the silver band over my knuckle. "It belongs exclusively to our superior bloodline. It belongs to a woman of high pedigree and pure generational wealth, not some cheap little data entry nobody who tricked my idiot brother into proposing. You are not walking out of this expensive restaurant wearing a $50,000 diamond that our glorious grandfather originally purchased." Jamal instantly jumped up from his chair, shouting at his wife to immediately let go of me, but Richard violently barked at him to sit back down and stay out of family business. Liam, the man who placed that very ring on my finger, just watched the entire physical assault happen with blank, detached, cowardly eyes. He did not make a single move to protect me from his deranged sister. He simply allowed her to violently, physically attack me because it made his own cowardly life significantly easier. The sheer physical sting of her sharp nails digging deeply into my trapped wrist was nothing compared to the deep, profound disgust I felt looking at my pathetic fiancé sitting there doing absolutely nothing. Claire gave one final massive, aggressive yank, completely determined to strip the beautiful ring away and claim her ultimate dominant victory over my supposed poverty. She felt incredibly powerful and righteous, aggressively assaulting a woman she deemed totally inferior. But she had made a massive, catastrophic miscalculation. I was not a weak, helpless victim, and I was absolutely done playing their sick, twisted games. I planted my feet firmly on the solid floor, tightened every single muscle in my left arm, and violently ripped my hand backward with an intense, explosive force that she entirely did not expect. The sudden, powerful movement completely broke her painful, tight grip instantly. Claire stumbled awkwardly forward, heavily hitting her hip against the sharp, solid edge of the mahogany dining table. She let out a loud, dramatic gasp of pure shock, clutching her side as she glared at me with absolute, intense, burning hatred. I calmly rubbed my sore wrist. Claire stumbled backward, hitting the heavy wooden dining table after I violently ripped my hand away from her vicious, painful grip. She gasped loudly, clutching her side, and stared at me with pure, unadulterated shock. She had fully expected me to simply surrender and let her strip me of my dignity without a single physical fight. But that pathetic, helpless version of Sienna was officially gone forever. I slowly raised my left hand, holding it up high, so the warm luxury chandelier light caught the sparkling facets of the 2-carat diamond ring resting securely on my finger. The entire private dining room went completely dead silent. You could easily hear a pin drop on the expensive, polished hardwood floor. Even the young, polite waiter who had been nervously hovering near the doorway wisely decided to step back into the long hallway to avoid the massive incoming explosion. I looked down at the bright red marks Claire had just dug deeply into my wrist, and then I shifted my intense gaze directly to her heavily powdered face. My expression was no longer fearful or submissive in any way. It was carved out of pure, solid, calculating ice. "You really love to use that specific word, Claire," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm and incredibly even pitch. "Bloodline. You talk constantly about your superior family legacy and your priceless generational wealth, as if you are actual royalty sitting high on a golden throne looking down at the peasants. You just physically assaulted me in a public five-star restaurant over what you falsely claim is a sacred old family heirloom. I slowly turned my head and locked my cold, piercing eyes directly onto Liam. He suddenly looked incredibly small, shrinking back into his plush leather dining chair, like a frightened little boy about to be severely punished by his strict parents. "Is that the pathetic, ridiculous lie you told your arrogant sister Liam?" I asked, my tone completely devoid of any remaining warmth or romantic affection. "Did you actually sit around the exclusive country club sipping expensive drinks and tell your incredibly snobby family that you romantically proposed to me using the priceless antique diamond ring of your beloved grandfather?" I let out a soft, chilling laugh that made Beatrice physically flinch in her expensive seat. The sheer level of desperate, tragic delusion in this private room is honestly staggering to witness. I lowered my hand and placed it flat on the polished mahogany table, tapping my ring finger deliberately against the solid wood. The sharp metallic clicking sound echoed loudly in the quiet, tense space. "Let us completely clear the toxic air right now," I announced, looking back and forth between Richard and Beatrice with absolute authority. "This ring is absolutely not a precious family heirloom. It did not belong to your wealthy, beloved grandfather, and it certainly does not belong to your supposedly superior aristocratic bloodline. It is a mass-produced commercial diamond that Liam purchased exactly 4 months ago from a generic retail jewelry chain located in a highly populated suburban shopping mall. I even know the exact full name of the terribly underpaid teenage sales associate who helped him proudly pick it out from the brightly lit discount display case. He bought it during a special promotional holiday weekend sale because they were generously offering a free silver cleaning cloth with every major jewelry purchase. The look of absolute horror that quickly washed over the face of Claire was completely priceless. Her jaw actually dropped wide open as she looked at her brother, desperately waiting for him to furiously deny my humiliating factual claim. But Liam just stared blankly at his empty dinner plate, his face burning a bright, shameful shade of deep crimson red. But the truly embarrassing part is not where he bought it. I continued leaning slightly forward to ensure every single person heard my next devastating words perfectly clearly. The truly humiliating part is exactly how he chose to pay for it today. Since your incredibly successful son does not actually have a functioning trust fund, and his personal checking account is constantly hovering dangerously near zero, he could not actually afford to buy this cheap ring outright. So he financed the entire purchase. He opened a brand new retail credit card with a completely predatory 29% annual interest rate just to blindly maintain the incredibly fragile illusion that he is a wealthy, highly successful man. And because he foolishly spends all of his tiny, meager salary trying to desperately keep up appearances with his rich elite friends, he has not been able to make the simple minimum monthly payments. I looked directly into the wide, shocked, angry eyes of Richard. "Your successful corporate heir is exactly 3 months behind on his jewelry payments, Richard. The aggressive debt collection agency has been relentlessly calling his personal cell phone exactly 4 times a day for the past 3 weeks straight. He has been silently rejecting their desperate calls while simultaneously sitting right here, happily bragging to you about his massive billionaire venture capitalist connections." The absolute profound silence that immediately followed my devastating financial revelation was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. The smug, arrogant smiles completely melted off their faces, entirely replaced by expressions of sheer panic and deep social embarrassment. Beatrice covered her open mouth with her manicured hand, looking at her beloved son, as if he had just transformed into a disgusting monster right in front of her eyes. The face of Richard turned a dangerous shade of purple, his neck bulging tightly against his expensive silk tie. He was a man who worshipped financial power and public perception above all else, and I had publicly exposed his favorite son as a complete broke fraud. Claire slowly backed away from me, retreating to her empty chair on trembling, unsteady legs. The sacred illusion of ultimate superiority was completely shattered now. The heavy silence in the private dining room was absolutely electric after the humiliating truth about the cheap financed engagement ring had been exposed. Claire was still clutching her side, breathing heavily as she glared at me from across the room. Richard and Beatrice were staring at Liam with absolute disgust, horrified that their supposed wealthy heir was actively dodging aggressive debt collectors over a discount diamond. I slowly shifted my intense gaze away from my pathetic fiancé and looked directly back at Beatrice. She was sitting rigidly in her expensive chair, her heavily powdered face looking suddenly pale under the warm chandelier light. The crisp $50,000 check was still resting exactly where she had pushed it on the polished mahogany table. It was supposed to be her ultimate weapon of absolute supreme power. It was supposed to be the massive fortune that would force the poor data entry girl to pack up her cheap bags and run away forever. I reached out my right hand, extending my fingers slowly toward the piece of paper. The entire table held its collective breath. Despite the massive humiliation they had just suffered, Beatrice allowed a tiny, smug smile to creep back onto her face. She genuinely believed that despite everything, my supposed deep poverty would still force me to take the generous bribe. She thought money was the only thing that actually mattered in this world. I gently picked up the thick leather paper, holding it between my index finger and my thumb. I looked at the bold black ink spelling out the massive sum of $50,000. Then I looked right into the cold blue eyes of Beatrice. I gripped the left edge of the check with my other hand, and I deliberately ripped it straight down the middle. The loud tearing sound of the thick, expensive paper echoed sharply in the quiet room, making Beatrice jump in her heavy wooden seat. I placed the two torn halves together and ripped them again and then again. I continued tearing the crisp paper until the massive $50,000 bribe was nothing more than a small pile of tiny, worthless confetti resting in the palm of my hand. "Are you completely out of your mind?" Beatrice gasped, her voice trembling with pure, unadulterated shock. I calmly picked up my crystal water glass, the exact same glass she had mockingly asked the young waiter to put in a cheap plastic to-go box just a few minutes ago. I held my hand over the rim and slowly opened my fingers, letting the tiny shredded pieces of the expensive check fall gently into the clear water. They floated quietly on the surface before slowly sinking to the bottom like pathetic little white stones. "You are going to need that money to pay your own massive mortgages next month, Beatrice," I said, my voice perfectly even and incredibly cold. "I do not want a single dime of your highly toxic debt." Before Richard could open his mouth to start screaming at me for destroying his wealth, the heavy double doors of the private dining room swung open once again. This time, it was not the young waiter returning to take our dinner orders. It was a tall, distinguished older man, wearing a tailored dark suit with a shiny gold name tag pinned to his lapel. He was the general manager of the entire elite restaurant, and he carried an aura of absolute professional authority. Richard immediately sat up completely straight, violently straightening his expensive silk tie. He assumed the young waiter had reported my disruptive behavior, and he fully believed the general manager was here to permanently remove me from the luxury premises. "It is about time you showed up here," Richard barked aggressively, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. "This ungrateful woman has been causing a massive scene in your private dining room all evening. She is completely harassing my wealthy family and making my beautiful daughter feel physically unsafe. I want you to call your security team immediately and have her forcibly dragged out of this respectable establishment right now. Do not let her grab her cheap little coat. Just throw her directly out onto the dirty street where she belongs." Richard crossed his arms over his chest, leaning back in his chair with a smug and victorious smile. He completely expected the general manager to apologize profusely and immediately comply with his cruel demands. The distinguished general manager did not even look at Richard. He completely ignored the arrogant, screaming man and walked directly toward my side of the long mahogany table. He stopped exactly 2 feet away from my chair, placed his hands behind his back, and offered me a deep, respectful bow. It was not a simple polite nod, but a profound gesture of absolute ultimate deference. "Good evening, Miss Sienna," the general manager said. his deep voice filling the quiet, tense room with intense respect. "I deeply apologize for interrupting your private dinner party tonight. I just wanted to personally come in and assure you that your elite corporate account has already cleared the entire tab for this restaurant this evening. As always, it is a profound honor to have you dining with us tonight. Shall I have the sommelier bring up your favorite vintage Bordeaux from the locked private cellar now?" The entire family practically stopped breathing at the same time. The smug, arrogant smile literally slid right off the face of Richard. Beatrice looked like she had just been struck by a speeding truck. Liam sat there with his mouth hanging wide open, staring at the respectful manager, and then staring at me in total disbelief. The general manager of the most exclusive restaurant in the city was not kicking me out. He was bowing to me and publicly confirming that my private account had just effortlessly paid for every single diner in the entire building. The ultimate truth was finally out. The distinguished general manager bowed once more and quietly backed out of the private dining room, letting the heavy mahogany doors click shut behind him. The sound of that latch falling into place felt like a vault locking the rest of the family inside with me. All of their perceived power had just evaporated into the crisp air conditioning. Richard was staring at the closed doors, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, but no sound came out. Beatrice looked physically ill, her powdered face turning a sickly shade of gray. Liam was completely paralyzed, gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were entirely white. I did not give them a single second to recover from the massive psychological blow. I calmly reached into my designer leather handbag. I bypassed my wallet and my car keys. My fingers wrapped around a thick red ink pen that I specifically kept for reviewing complex merger contracts at my corporate office. I pulled it out and placed it gently on the table. The bright red barrel of the pen stood out violently against the pristine white tablecloth. Then I reached across the table and slowly pulled the 40-page prenuptial agreement right back toward me. I clicked the top of the pen. The sharp metallic snap echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. "You know, Richard?" I began, my voice dropping into the precise authoritative tone I used during hostile boardroom negotiations. "When you proudly boasted earlier that your top-tier corporate lawyers drafted this aggressive document to permanently protect your massive generational wealth, I believed you for a brief moment. I assumed I was about to read a highly sophisticated, legally binding fortress. But since we are laying all of our cards out on the table tonight, I think it is only fair that I offer you a complimentary legal consultation." I flipped open the thick document to the very first page and immediately dragged the bold red pen straight across the first 3 paragraphs. The loud scratching sound of the ink tearing into the expensive paper made Richard physically flinch. "You see, Richard?" I continued, turning the page and aggressively circling a massive block of text. Section 4, paragraph B, regarding the total indemnification of premarital corporate assets, is completely unenforceable in this specific state. Your cheap lawyers used an outdated boilerplate template from the late 90s. By actively attempting to force me to assume 50% of Liam U.S. personal credit card debt, while simultaneously walling off his supposed trust fund, you have created a massive legal paradox regarding the commingling of future marital assets. I flipped to the 7th page, drawing a massive red X across the entire sheet. Furthermore, your explicit clause regarding the protection of your primary real estate holdings under the umbrella of your family shell corporation is vulnerable to a basic legal piercing of the corporate veil. If Liam and I were to actually get married and subsequently divorce, a decent first-year law student could easily argue that your family casually uses that specific shell company as a personal piggy bank. They could legally drag your entire supposed real estate empire directly into the divorce discovery process. You did not draft an ironclad shield, Richard. You actually drafted a giant glowing roadmap leading directly to all of your hidden financial liabilities. I looked up from the ruined document and locked my cold eyes directly onto his sweating face. Richard was gripping the arms of his chair, his chest heaving as he struggled to process the highly complex corporate legal jargon flowing effortlessly out of my mouth. The arrogant billionaire real estate tycoon persona was rapidly melting away, revealing the terrified old man hiding underneath. He tried to open his mouth to interrupt me to somehow regain his lost dominance, but I raised my red pen, silencing him completely. "Do not interrupt me, Richard, because I am just getting to the absolute best part of your terrible legal strategy," I warned sharply. I flipped to the very back of the prenuptial agreement, specifically targeting the detailed appendix that listed their supposedly massive corporate assets. I tapped the red pen aggressively against the listed net worth of his primary commercial real estate firm. "You went through all this incredible trouble to legally protect this specific holding company. But my proprietary financial software algorithms naturally ran a comprehensive predictive market analysis on your commercial properties last week. I know exactly what you are desperately trying to hide from the public market. I know that you are massively over-leveraged on your 3 biggest downtown commercial development projects. I know that your primary corporate lenders are actively preparing to issue massive margin calls by the end of this financial quarter because your rental occupancy rates have totally flatlined. Your supposed multi-million-dollar real estate empire is actually drowning in over $40 million of toxic high-interest corporate debt. You are bankrupt, Richard. Your entire grand family legacy is absolutely nothing but a hollow, fragile house of cards, just waiting for a single strong breeze to knock it entirely down to the ground." Color drained from Richard. He looked like he was about to have a medical emergency in his tailored suit. He looked at Beatrice, who was pressing hands against her chest, breathing in short gasps. Claire and Jamal stared at Richard in absolute shock, unable to comprehend the financial reality I exposed. Liam was staring at his father with terrified eyes, realizing his luxurious fake life was gone. I placed the cap onto my red pen with a soft click. I pushed the heavily bleeding marked-up prenuptial agreement back across the table toward Richard. The document was covered in red ink, completely destroying his pathetic illusion of control. "You tried to trap me in a burning building, Richard," I whispered, leaning back in my wooden chair. "But you forgot to check if I was holding the matches." I watched the horrifying realization slowly wash over the face of Richard as the heavy mahogany doors clicked shut. His grand illusion of absolute corporate dominance was completely shattered, leaving nothing but a desperate bankrupt old man sweating profusely in his tailored suit. But I was not entirely finished yet. I slowly turned my head and shifted my intense, calculating gaze directly toward the man sitting completely frozen to my left. Liam was staring at his father with wide, terrified eyes, his mouth hanging slightly open. He looked like a frightened little boy who had just realized the protective walls of his giant castle were actually made of cheap, wet cardboard. I reached out and gently tapped my manicured fingernail against the polished wooden table, drawing his frantic attention back to me. "Let us circle back to your earlier pathetic excuse, Liam," I said, my voice dropping to a low, deceptively gentle whisper that commanded the entire private room. "You sat there sipping expensive wine and told me you had to betray our relationship to protect your precious family legacy. You explicitly told me you helped draft that draconian prenuptial agreement because you desperately needed to legally protect your massive generational trust fund." Liam swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his tight throat. He tried to nod, attempting to desperately cling to his fabricated elite identity. But he could not force a single word out of his mouth. I offered him a cold, merciless smile. "That was the absolute ultimate tragedy of your pathetic cowardice tonight, Liam. You sold your actual soul and destroyed a woman who genuinely loved you to protect a massive fortune that simply does not exist." I watched his brow furrow in deep, confused panic. Claire, who was still clutching her bruised side, leaning against the back of her heavy wooden chair, suddenly snapped her head toward me. "What the hell are you talking about now, Sienna?" Claire demanded, her shrill voice trembling with a sudden, terrifying new fear. "Our trust funds are securely locked in offshore private accounts. Our grandfather specifically set them up for us before he passed away. You are just a vindictive little liar, making up crazy financial stories because my mother completely humiliated you tonight. I did not bother arguing with her. Panicked denial. I calmly reached back into my designer leather handbag. I bypassed the thick red pen and reached deep into the bottom compartment, pulling out a crisp manila folder. I placed the folder on the table and flipped it open, revealing a thick stack of highly classified banking documents. I slid the top 2 pages across the smooth table directly toward Liam and Claire. I highly suggest you read the specific account numbers and the corresponding transaction dates on those official bank statements. I instructed, my voice echoing with absolute undeniable authority. Your wealthy grandfather absolutely set up those generous trust funds for both of you, but he made one massive, catastrophic mistake before he died. He made your father the primary financial executor of those specific accounts until you both reached the age of 35. I watched Liam hesitantly pick up the piece of paper, his hands trembling violently. Claire practically snatched her copy off the table, her eyes darting frantically across the black ink. Exactly 2 years ago, when Richard first realized his commercial real estate firm was hemorrhaging massive amounts of cash, he desperately needed liquid capital to cover his illegal corporate margin calls. I explained, enunciating every single word with brutal clarity. The corporate lenders were threatening to completely expose his massive fraud. So your loving father quietly drained both of your irrevocable trust funds down to the absolute last penny to secretly bail himself out. Liam stared at the official bank statement. The paper clearly showed his massive multi-million-dollar balance being entirely transferred into the primary holding company of his father. The current balance, printed in bold black ink at the very bottom of the page, was a completely devastating zero. There was absolutely nothing left, not a single dime. The luxury lifestyle he had been so proudly boasting about all evening was nothing but a complete hallucination. He had been walking around this entire city acting like a powerful billionaire heir, when in reality he was just an unemployed broke man drowning in massive high-interest credit card debt with absolutely no safety net to catch him. The billionaire venture capitalist's daughter he was planning to date tomorrow would take one single look at his destroyed financial portfolio and laugh directly in his face before having her private security team escort him off her massive estate. I watched the profound, soul-crushing realization physically hit him. He dropped the paper onto his empty dinner plate and covered his mouth with his shaking hands. Claire did not react with silent horror like her brother. She reacted with pure, explosive rage. She crumpled the bank statement in her fist and turned her vicious glare directly toward her father. "You stole from me!" Claire screamed at the absolute top of her lungs, her voice cracking with intense, terrifying fury. "You stole my entire future to save your pathetic failing company, you disgusting old man!" Richard frantically raised his hands, trying desperately to calm his furious daughter down. "Now, Claire, please, you have to understand the complex corporate nuances," he stammered, his face pale with panic. "I was going to pay it all back as soon as the new projects became profitable. It was just a temporary strategic loan to protect the overall family legacy." "A temporary loan," Claire shrieked, lunging forward and grabbing the lapels of his expensive tailored suit. "You completely bankrupted me. I am $80,000 in debt right now because you told me my trust fund was perfectly safe." Beatrice began wailing loudly as her perfect elite family tore itself apart. I sat back, calmly watching the absolute destruction. The toxic empire was officially burning down. The screaming of Claire filled the room as she grabbed Richard's suit. She was crying, demanding her stolen trust fund money back, while Beatrice sat frozen in her chair, sobbing uncontrollably into her napkin. Liam stared blankly at his bank statement, looking like his pathetic universe had just collapsed. During this screaming match, a loud classical music ringtone echoed across the polished mahogany table. Richard ripped himself away from his furious daughter and fumbled frantically in his pocket. He pulled out his smartphone and looked down at the glowing screen. I watched the intense panic on his face vanish, replaced by a massive wave of pure, arrogant relief. He looked up at me with wild, triumphant eyes, ignoring his furious daughter standing next to him. He held the ringing phone high in the air like a glowing sword. "Do you hear that ringing sound right now?" Richard yelled over the crying of his ruined family. "That is the billionaire chief executive officer of Vanguard Holdings calling my cell phone. He is calling to finalize the venture capital bailout that will save our real estate empire." Richard pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, a cruel, victorious smile stretching across his face. "You thought you could destroy me with a few stolen bank statements, Sienna, but you are wrong. This phone call proves my ultimate power. Everyone sit down and shut your mouths because I am putting this business call on speakerphone for the entire room to hear." Richard slammed the smartphone down in the center of the wooden dining table and tapped the green speaker button. He cleared his throat, trying to project his fake billionaire persona one last time. "Good evening, my good friend Richard," boomed his voice, dripping with fake confidence. "I am enjoying a luxury dinner with my family, but I always have time for my corporate partners. Please tell me you are calling with the final wire transfer details for our real estate expansion project." The entire dining room went completely dead silent. Claire stopped crying and stared hopefully at the glowing phone. Liam leaned forward, praying that this magical billionaire would save his luxurious, lazy lifestyle. But the voice that echoed out of the small speaker did not sound friendly at all. It sounded incredibly cold, sharp, and ruthless. "Richard, there is no wire transfer happening tonight, or ever." The billionaire investor announced, his deep voice cutting through the tense air like a sharp, icy blade. "My corporate due diligence team just finished running a massive forensic audit on your real estate portfolio this afternoon. We found the massive hidden debts. We found the toxic loans and the missing trust fund money you used to cover your failing corporate margins. You have been running a fraudulent house of cards, Richard, and you lied to my firm about your catastrophic financial health. Therefore, Vanguard Holdings is officially terminating all business negotiations with you immediately. We are pulling out of the bailout deal, and my legal team is forwarding our detailed financial findings to the federal regulatory boards tomorrow morning." Richard physically collapsed back into his heavy dining chair, as if he had just been shot in the chest. His face turned a terrifying shade of paper white, and his hands shook violently. "No, please, you cannot do this to me," Richard begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine. "You promised to save my company. My son is supposed to date your beautiful daughter. If you pull your venture capital funding right now, the aggressive corporate banks will liquidate my entire family legacy by the end of this week. I will lose absolutely everything." "You already lost everything," Richard the billionaire replied without a single ounce of human sympathy. "And regarding my daughter, I would rather send her to live on a deserted island than ever let her near your broke, fraudulent son. But the ultimate decision to terminate your massive bailout did not actually come from me. Vanguard Holdings was quietly acquired by a massive financial technology parent company 3 weeks ago. My new corporate bosses ran your terrible numbers, and they personally ordered me to completely burn your fraudulent real estate firm to the ground tonight. In fact, the brilliant founder and chief executive officer of our new parent company specifically instructed me to call your cell phone at this exact time." I calmly leaned forward in my wooden chair, resting my elbows smoothly on the pristine white tablecloth. I looked right at the glowing smartphone resting next to the torn pieces of the $50,000 check. "Good evening, Thomas," I said, my voice perfectly steady and incredibly clear. "Thank you so much for executing those strict corporate orders so perfectly tonight." The voice of the powerful billionaire instantly softened completely, losing its cold, aggressive edge. He responded with a tone of profound, absolute respect that made Richard physically gasp for air. "Good evening, Boss," Thomas replied cheerfully through the small speaker. "It is an absolute honor to hear your voice tonight. I completely finalized the termination paperwork exactly as you instructed Miss Sienna. Your proprietary algorithms were absolutely right about his massive hidden corporate fraud. Is there anything else you need me to destroy for you tonight?" The sheer level of absolute devastating shock that hit the family was completely indescribable. Richard was clutching his chest, his mouth opening and closing silently as his brain completely short-circuited. Beatrice let out a soft, pathetic whimpering sound, sliding down lower into her expensive chair. Liam looked at me as if I had just transformed into a powerful god right in front of his eyes. I was not just a poor data entry girl. I was the supreme corporate authority they had been desperately begging for money. I owned the billionaire who just completely destroyed their entire fake empire. I smiled very coldly at the phone. "That will be all, Thomas," I replied calmly. "Please enjoy the rest of your evening." The small glowing screen of the smartphone went completely dark as I ended the call with Thomas. The absolute silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. It was the kind of profound quiet that only exists right after a massive explosion. Richard was slouched in his heavy mahogany chair looking like a deflated balloon. His tailored suit suddenly seemed entirely too big for his shaking body. Beatrice was clutching her expensive pearl necklace, her heavily powdered face completely frozen in an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. Claire had stopped her loud, dramatic screaming and was staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes, as if she were looking at a terrifying alien creature that had just landed on the dinner table. And Liam, my pathetic, cowardly fiancé, was trembling violently, his knuckles completely white as he gripped the edge of the polished table. He could not even bring himself to look directly into my eyes anymore. The grand illusion of their supreme wealth and absolute power had just evaporated into thin air, leaving them completely exposed and incredibly vulnerable. I slowly picked up my own crystal water glass, taking a very calm, refreshing sip before setting it back down with a soft, deliberate click. I looked around the room, soaking in the glorious sight of their complete and utter destruction. "You spent this entire evening brutally mocking my simple clothes, my cheap apartment, and my supposed low-paying data entry job." I began, my voice perfectly even and echoing with absolute authority. "You called me a worthless gold digger and a pathetic charity case, but you were entirely wrong about everything. I do not just do basic data entry for some random local office. I am the sole founder and majority shareholder of the exact financial technology giant that just completely consumed Vanguard Holdings in a massive corporate acquisition. I personally engineered that massive billionaire buyout while you were busy bragging about your fake country club memberships. I take home over $5 million every single year, in base salary alone, entirely separate from my massive stock options and my extensive real estate portfolio." I watched the numbers slowly process in their terrified minds. $5 million a year. That was significantly more cash than Richard had generated in his entire struggling career. "You asked me earlier why I still drive a 10-year-old Honda Civic if I am supposedly so brilliant," I said, leaning forward, resting my arms comfortably on the table. "You told me my modest apartment was undeniable proof of my poverty mindset. But you are the ones who completely misunderstand how true wealth actually works. A luxury car is just a rapidly depreciating asset designed to impress complete strangers. Expensive designer clothes are just a desperate cry for social validation. I do not care about looking rich because I am actually wealthy. I keep my personal expenses incredibly low because I aggressively channel all of my available liquid capital into my primary business strategy. I use my massive cash reserves to systematically hunt down and acquire failing, incompetent companies that are drowning in bad debt. Companies exactly like yours, Richard." The blood drained completely from his face once again. He looked at me with absolute profound horror, realizing that I was not just his son's discarded fiancé. I was the apex predator of his corporate world. I could crush him with a single phone call, and I just proved it to the entire table. "You see, Beatrice?" I continued, turning my cold gaze toward the terrified woman who had tried to bribe me with a $50,000 check. "You thought you were throwing a massive fortune at a helpless girl tonight. You thought that piece of paper made you an absolute queen. but to me, $50,000 is just the loose change I spend on corporate catering for my board meetings every single month. Your entire pathetic family is completely obsessed with maintaining a fragile public image while your actual bank accounts are bleeding dry. Liam lied to me for months, pretending to be a highly successful heir when he is actually just a broke, lazy child who cannot even afford his own groceries. He wanted a wealthy woman in his tax bracket, and he completely failed to realize he was already dating someone far beyond his wildest dreams. I stood up slowly from my heavy mahogany chair, smoothing down the front of my sensible work dress. It was the exact same outfit they had viciously mocked just an hour ago, but now they looked at it like it was woven out of solid gold. I looked down at the four of them sitting in absolute ruins. Their fake superiority was completely shattered. They were entirely broken by their own insatiable greed and pathetic superficial judgments. You thought you could completely humiliate me and force me into absolute submission, I said, my voice ringing with total finality in the quiet private room. You thought your terrible prenuptial agreement was a brilliant corporate trap, but you were the ones walking blindly into the slaughterhouse tonight. Your entire failing real estate company is going to be systematically liquidated by my aggressive legal team starting tomorrow morning. Every single luxury car, every fake designer bag, and every country club membership will be aggressively seized to pay down your massive toxic debts. You are going to lose absolutely everything, Richard. And the absolute best part is that you literally brought it entirely upon yourselves. If you had just treated me with 1 single ounce of basic human decency, you might have actually survived this financial quarter. But you chose to be monsters instead. I picked up my leather handbag and slung it over my shoulder. Enjoy your cold appetizers, I told them, with a cold, victorious smile. I am going back to my extremely quiet and incredibly cheap little city apartment right now because I have a truly massive and successful corporate empire to proudly run tomorrow morning. The heavy mahogany doors remained shut, isolating the six of us inside the luxurious private dining room. The air was incredibly thick, heavy with the destruction of their massive fabricated empire. Richard was completely slumped in his chair, his face buried in his trembling hands. Beatrice was quietly weeping her tears, ruining her expensive makeup. Liam sat entirely frozen, his jaw open, completely unable to process the staggering reality that the woman he just betrayed was actually a massive, multi-million-dollar corporate titan. I slowly reached back into my leather handbag for the absolute final time tonight. I did not pull out another pen or another torn check. I pulled out a thick, glossy black folder tightly sealed with a silver clasp. It contained the complete unredacted financial forensics report that my acquisition team had compiled regarding the failing real estate firm Richard was so incredibly proud of. It held every single dark, terrible secret he had spent the last 5 years desperately trying to hide from the wealthy public. As I placed the heavy black folder onto the polished mahogany table, Liam suddenly shifted in his seat. He reached his shaking hand forward, fully expecting me to slide the confidential documents over to him. He actually still foolishly believed he deserved a seat at the adult table. He thought because he was the beloved son, he inherently deserved to see the private family numbers first. I completely ignored his outstretched hand. I did not bother giving him a single glance. He was entirely irrelevant to me now. Instead, I picked up the heavy black folder and walked around the edge of the large dining table. I walked right past Richard and Beatrice, ignoring their pathetic, quiet sobbing. I stopped directly behind the chair where Jamal was sitting. Jamal, the incredibly hardworking self-made logistics manager who had spent years biting his tongue and swallowing his pride just to keep the fragile peace in this deeply toxic family. The man who had been viciously subjected to the terrible racist microaggressions and endless classist insults from Richard just an hour ago. I gently placed the thick black folder directly in front of him, resting my hand lightly on his broad shoulder for a brief moment of silent solidarity. Jamal, I said, my voice entirely losing its icy corporate edge and softening into a tone of genuine respect. You are the only other person in this entire miserable room who actually knows what it means to work a brutally honest job. You built your highly successful logistics career completely from the ground up through sheer fierce intelligence and relentless late-night dedication. You have been forced to sit at these suffocating family dinners for years, listening to these terrible people constantly belittle your achievements because you do not come from their supposedly elite aristocratic background. I tapped the glossy black cover of the folder with my manicured fingernail. I think it is only fair that you are the exact person who gets to formally read the official final score tonight. Jamal looked up at me, his dark brown eyes wide with absolute shock. He slowly reached out his strong hands and unfastened the silver clasp. He opened the heavy black folder and began to read the crisp white pages inside. The room was so incredibly quiet. You could hear the soft rustling of the paper as he flipped through the detailed financial forensics report. I watched the expression on his handsome face rapidly shift and completely transform. First, there was deep, genuine confusion as he processed the massive numbers. Then a sharp flash of profound clarity washed over his features as he suddenly realized exactly what he was looking at. He saw the massive, hidden commercial debts. He saw the terrifying high-interest corporate loans. He saw the completely drained offshore trust funds and the massive incoming margin calls that were guaranteed to completely destroy the entire family legacy by the end of the current financial quarter. A heavy silence hung in the air for 10 long seconds. And then Jamal started to laugh. It did not start as a quiet, subtle chuckle. It started deep within his chest, building rapidly into a massive, booming, joyous belly laugh that completely shattered the tension in the private dining room. He laughed so incredibly hard that tears actually began to stream down his face. He threw his head back, laughing at the staggering absurdity of his deeply racist, completely broken laws. Richard lifted his head from his shaking hands, glaring at Jamal with weak, pathetic anger. "What is so completely funny, you ungrateful outsider?" Richard snapped, his voice trembling with exhausted desperation. Jamal aggressively slammed the open folder down onto the table, pointing a firm finger directly at the terrified older man. "What is incredibly funny, Richard, is that you spent this entire miserable evening telling me to quietly know my proper lowly place." Jamal boomed, his powerful voice echoing beautifully off the wood-paneled walls. "You practically called me a useless peasant who should be endlessly grateful for your massive generational wealth. But I am looking right at your verified financial statements right now. You are completely bankrupt, Richard. Your entire multi-million-dollar real estate empire is absolutely worthless. In fact, my independent logistics company generated more actual liquid profit last month than your pathetic fraudulent firm has made in the last 3 entire years." Jamal abruptly pushed his heavy wooden chair back and stood up tall, completely towering over the entire ruined family. He turned his fierce, confident gaze directly toward Claire, who was sitting completely frozen in absolute terror. "And as for you, Claire," Jamal said, his tone ringing with absolute finality, "I am entirely done constantly apologizing for my background, just to make your fragile, insecure ego feel slightly better. You can keep your fake designer bags and your completely ruined elite social standing. I am officially filing for a total absolute divorce first thing tomorrow morning." Jamal stood tall, completely dominating the room with his newfound freedom. As Jamal turned his back on the toxic family that had tormented him, Liam suddenly snapped out of his paralyzed state. He violently pushed his chair back loudly, scraping against the floor, and rushed around the mahogany table toward me. He looked frantic, his carefully styled hair messy, his expensive suit disheveled. He reached out with trembling hands, desperately trying to grab my arm, but I took a sharp step back, my eyes warning him not to touch me. "Sienna, please wait," he begged, his voice cracking with sheer panic and profound desperation. "You cannot leave me here like this. You have to understand, none of this was actually my idea. It was all them." He aggressively pointed a shaking finger at his completely ruined parents, who were too busy drowning in their own catastrophic misery to defend themselves. My father forced me to go along with this terrible plan. He told me he would completely cut me out of the family if I did not help him secure the venture capital funding. My mother was the one who viciously attacked your apartment and your clothes. I never wanted to sign that awful prenuptial agreement. I was just incredibly scared of losing my inheritance. I love you, Sienna. You know I love you. We can completely start over right now. We do not need them or their toxic money anymore. We can build our own incredible empire together. I stood there looking at the pathetic man who had promised to protect me. He was completely willing to throw his own parents under the bus the absolute second their fake wealth evaporated. He had no loyalty, no backbone, and absolutely no moral compass. He was just a cowardly parasite, desperately looking for a brand new rich host to securely latch onto. I slowly raised my left hand and looked at the 2-carat diamond ring resting on my finger. The ring he financed on a predatory credit card. The ring that represented nothing but a massive web of pathetic lies and shallow social climbing. I grabbed the silver band with my right hand and smoothly slid it right off my finger. The metal felt cold and completely meaningless. I looked Liam directly in his desperate, pleading eyes. "You never loved me, Liam," I said, my voice echoing with an icy, absolute finality. "You only loved the incredibly comfortable illusion that you were somehow better than me. You wanted a woman in your elite tax bracket. Well, congratulations. You are completely broke and so am I to you." I extended my hand over the table, holding the sparkling diamond directly above his half-full crystal glass of expensive red wine. I opened my fingers and let the ring drop. It hit the dark liquid with a final splash, sinking straight to the bottom. Liam let out a choked sob, staring down at the ruined jewelry. I remained entirely silent. I turned around, adjusted my leather handbag, and walked confidently out of the private dining room. I pushed open the heavy double doors, leaving the toxic wreckage of their entire fake dynasty completely behind me. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped out of the luxury restaurant, and for the first time in months, I felt entirely able to breathe. I walked to my sensible older car, slid into the driver's seat, and smiled. The fast forward over the next 3 months was incredibly brutal for Richard and his arrogant family. The natural consequences of their insatiable greed and massive corporate fraud arrived with devastating precision. Just as I had predicted, my aggressive corporate legal team immediately initiated the systematic liquidation of his deeply failing real estate firm. The powerful corporate lenders issued massive margin calls, and Richard had absolutely nothing left to give them. His entire multi-million-dollar commercial empire was completely seized and dismantled piece by exact piece. The public humiliation was absolutely spectacular. Their elite social circle immediately abandoned them the second the bankruptcy went public. Beatrice was forcefully stripped of her precious country club membership because she could no longer afford the exorbitant monthly dues. She was forced to sell her expensive designer handbags and diamond jewelry just to keep the local bank from instantly foreclosing on their massive colonial mansion. And Liam, the man who arrogantly claimed he had a luxurious, high-class lifestyle to naturally maintain, was now fully ruined. Because he had no corporate skills and massive mounting credit card debt, he had to take a grueling minimum-wage retail job at a shopping mall. He now spends his exhausting days folding cheap clothes and dealing with angry, difficult customers just to barely make his minimum monthly payments. Meanwhile, my own life has never been more incredibly peaceful and authentically successful. I completely severed all contact with that highly toxic family and never looked back. I did maintain one valuable connection from that terrible night. True to his incredibly brave word, Jamal completely finalized his absolute divorce from Claire, leaving her to deal with her own massive financial ruin entirely alone. Once he was officially free from their suffocating racist grip, I invited him to my corporate penthouse office. We sat down with my top financial advisors, and I officially provided him with a massive angel investment to fully fund his brand new independent logistics company. He is a brilliant, relentlessly hardworking man, and within just 2 short months, his new business is already generating massive profits. We celebrate our mutual success with quiet, respectful dinners, where absolutely no one is ever judged by the price tag on their shoes or the age of their car. I finally learned the most important lesson. True ultimate wealth is not about flashy designer labels, exclusive country club memberships, or desperate social climbing. True wealth is the absolute total freedom to walk away from highly toxic people who hurt you forever. The greatest lesson I took away from that incredibly disastrous engagement dinner is that you absolutely cannot negotiate your fundamental self-worth with people who are firmly committed to entirely misunderstanding you. For months, I quietly shrank myself down, completely hiding my massive financial success and constantly ignoring the glaring red flags in my terrible relationship. I foolishly believed that if I was just extremely patient, highly accommodating, and totally supportive, my arrogant partner would eventually learn to genuinely value me. But toxic people do not respect your gentle kindness, they only violently exploit it to desperately feed their own deeply fragile egos. True wealth has absolutely nothing to do with massive bank accounts, expensive luxury cars, or exclusive elite country club memberships. Authentic wealth is the profound, unshakable confidence that proudly allows you to firmly establish hard boundaries and successfully protect your own mental peace. It is the absolute total freedom to confidently stand up from any table where love and basic respect are no longer being served. I powerfully reclaimed my life the exact second I finally stopped desperately trying to proudly prove my undeniable value to a deeply broken fake family. I successfully traded a cowardly, ungrateful fiancé for an incredibly bright, independent future, firmly surrounded by highly authentic, hardworking people who genuinely celebrate my true success. Now I would absolutely love to hear from all of you watching this video today. Have you ever been completely forced to bravely walk away from a highly toxic relationship or an incredibly manipulative family dynamic to successfully protect your own peace? Please share your powerful stories of personal triumph in the comments section below. If my journey deeply resonated with you today, please make sure to hit that subscribe button and quickly like this video right now for me.